All right, welcome to Unit 2, New Directions in Learning. The essential question of this unit is how has recent brain development research enlightened people's knowledge of child development? So hopefully after the end of this unit, you'll be able to answer that question. All right, so section 2.1, brain studies. Our objectives for this lesson is that you'll be able to describe the two major goals of recent child development research, compare the basic differences between the functions of neurons and glial cells, illustrate the process by which neurons communicate with each other, give 3 reasons brain plasticity is helpful, explain what is meant by using windows of opportunity to aid children's learning, and identify 2 offenders of normal brain functioning. In child development, people use the word learning in a broad sense. People might say learning is any permanent change in knowledge or behavior. The words learning and development are almost the same because both refer to changes in all domains. For example, a child learns motor skills, which is physical development, acquires knowledge of people, places, objects, and events, and even gains insight in how to learn, which is intellectual development, and hopefully you will gain some insight in this unit on how to learn. Learns to understand, speak, read, and write words, which is also intellectual development, learns how to interact with others, which is social development, and learns how to express emotions in a healthy way, which is emotional development. All changes result from some type of experience, like personal experiences in your environment, imitation, guided discovery, or direct instruction. Those are all ways that children learn. You need to remember those things. Okay, I'll say them again. Personal experiences, imitation, guided discovery, or direct instruction are the ways that children learn. They do not learn through memorization. Although the whole body is involved in learning, the command center of the body is the brain. The brain is responsible for controlling most body functions. These include operation of body systems, body movements, thinking, memory, and feelings. Scientists and other people who study and work with children have long been really curious about brain's growth, developmental change, activity, and potential damage. Until recently, the brain was mostly a mystery, although brain development was discovered through observing behaviors in children, especially through Piaget's research on intellectual milestones, which we remember from the last chapter, Piaget. In recent years, however, scientists have learned much more about brain development. Much of this knowledge is gained from the use of high-technology brain scans and advances in biochemistry, which is the chemistry of living organisms. An MRI is a specific type of brain scan that we use to learn about the brain. A large amount of brain research is now in progress. Although many questions have been answered, there are still a lot more for scientists to unravel. Okay, so brain biology. Brain development begins shortly after conception. Before a baby is born, they have 250,000 brain cells that are formed each minute. Full-term babies, ones that are born, have 100 billion brain cells. The brain is the least developed organ at birth, though. The brain is often compared to a computer, but unlike a computer, the brain is turned on long before it is completed, and you'll want to remember that fact for a worksheet that we're going to do. A newborn's brain is only about 25% the size of an adult brain. The newborn's brain develops rapidly in stages, which you can note by seeing increases in your child's head circumference, increases of 5 to 10% in brain weight during a stage, and changes in the cells. Brain growth happens when brain chemicals are released in waves. Brain growth occurs in a predictable biological sequence that is the same for all people. The stages of, and you'll need to remember that, the stages of fastest growth after birth are going to be shown a little bit later in this video. The stages of fastest, the time between each stage is used for practicing and gaining expertise and efficiency in the skills that they developed in a previous stage. For example, between 4 and 6 years, motor and sensory skills combine to develop eye-hand coordination that's needed for activities like catching balls or drawing or writing or playing musical instruments or even eating with forks and knives. All right, the brain is made up of 2 types of cells. The brain is made up of neurons, which are the nerve cells. They're the brain cells that send and receive chemical and electrical impulses among each other to direct the various tasks of the brain. That's a vocab word. Their overall task is to receive, process, and transport information needed by a person in order to perform all tasks, and we call this communication. There are 3 types of neurons, and each type has its own specific tasks. We'll talk about neurons and glial cells a little bit more, but first we're going to go back and talk about the stages of fastest brain growth after birth. So, as you can see, during 3 to 10 months is when the brain is turning on the control of motor actions, so lots of physical development happening there. Between 2 to 4 years is when senses are maturing, and they are by adult level. By the end of 4 years old, they have adult-like seeing and smelling capabilities. During 6 to 8 years, they begin to start thinking logically about actual experiences, unlike previous stages, which we are genetically programmed by your brain to take place. Logical thinking has to be something that is taught by adults and something that you have your children practice. And then 10 to 12 years in females and 12 to 14 in males, that's right, females, we mature faster than our male brethren, is the beginning of generalized thinking beyond our actual experiences, so we can do some abstract reasoning. Okay? It allows older children and teens, such as yourself, to understand higher mathematics and science. Okay, so I previously mentioned neurons. They send and receive electrical impulses. They direct various tasks within your brain. There's 3 types: sensory, motor, and interneurons, and then each has a cell body with dendrites and axons. And I'm going to go into on the next slides more about this information. The 3 parts of the neuron is the cell body, which contains genetic information and proteins for cell maintenance, like essentially to feed itself and keep itself up. The dendrites, which means trees, are short bushy cables that allow each neuron to receive signals sent by other neurons, which is the input function. So input in a computer, you put the information into it. Okay, that's what function dendrites have. They receive the information. The axons, which means axis, are long, thick cables that have terminal buttons, which are little knobs at the end of the axons, that can transmit all the signals from a neuron to other neurons. This is the output function of it. So when you output something, it's like exporting a document or sending an email would be the same as output function. So you're sending the information off rather than receiving it. So it's like receive versus send. Okay? And then another thing that we're going to talk about. So there are the 3 types of neurons are sensory neurons, which transfer information from your external environment to your central nervous system. There are motor neurons, which transfer information from the central nervous system to your external environment. And then interneurons, which process information in your central nervous system and transfer information from one neuron to another within your central nervous system. So they're interneurons. They interplay between each other. Moving on, we're going to talk about the other type of brain cell that you have, which is glial cells. Okay, glial cells are brain cells that help support your neurons. Glial means glue. About 90% of the cells in your brain are glial cells. There are 4 types of glial cells that support the neurons, which we will talk about on the next slide. Moving on. So, unlike neurons, glial cells divide, especially during times of your fastest brain growth. So neurons do not divide. You are born with your neurons. You don't make more of them. In fact, you lose some. Okay? But glial cells will. They will divide and make more of themselves, especially when your brain is growing really fast. Because different neurons need different amounts of support, they vary in density throughout the brain, so there will be lots of glial cells in one place and not very many in another. They have a large cell body with legs extending from the body, so you can look up a picture if you're interested in knowing what they look like, besides the picture that's on the slide. The 4 types of glial cells are as follows. Astrocytes, they help the neurons receive nutrients, nourishment, so they feed them. They control the chemical environment of your brain. They restrict certain substances from entering the brain, which, by the way, you only need to know these 4 types, possibly for action cards. You don't have to memorize them. Microglia, which remove cellular waste. Ependymal, which form a protective covering around your spinal cord and central brain cavities. And then oligodendrocytes, help insulate your axons with myelin. Oof, those are hard to pronounce. All right, so now we're going to quickly talk about the different areas of the brain and what they do. Okay, first of all, you have your temporal lobe. That is located on the side, kind of around where your ears are, like above and where your ears are. So touch that part on yourself right now and say temporal lobe. As you can imagine, it involves hearing, smell, memory, and speech. Then we have your frontal lobe. That's where your forehead is, all the way about to the middle of your skull. So go ahead and touch that area on your head right now. That area is involved in memory, intelligence, behavior, emotions, motor functions, planning, and smell as well. Then the parietal lobe is directly behind the frontal lobe, going towards the back of your head, but not quite the back of your head. Okay, so touch that area of your head now. That involves pain, touch, sensations of hot and cold, and speech. Then the occipital lobe is the very back of your head. Okay, that one is in charge of vision and speech. And then the cerebellum is kind of like where your neck meets like the base of your skull. If you touch that area, it's in that area. Your cerebellum controls your balance and your body movements. And then your brainstem, which extends down from your brain down to your spine. So you can try to touch that area, not very well. It controls your breathing, your heart rate, your blood pressure, your reflexes, and sleep. So now we're going to talk about different processes of the brain. Okay, it has to make and sort connections. Each area of your brain is very highly specialized. Before birth, all the cells have to migrate to their special locations. For example, neurons that end up migrating to your occipital lobe become vision neurons during the migration. Glial cells aid the migration by making fiber trails for them to follow. Neurons use them, to find the right location. And while they are migrating, the glial cells feed them and nourish them as well. So talking about the first type of process is the wiring process. This happens before birth. So wiring is present at birth. So this takes place in the womb. Okay, so in the beginning with the wiring process, neurons that need to make connections or communicate with each other will need to be near each other. Later, they will grow very long axons to reach distant neurons. The network of fibers that carry brain signals between the neurons, we call it wiring. Genes create your structure for wiring. So wiring for each person is completely unique. Some neurons are going to be permanently wired at birth. The neurons that are going to be permanently wired at birth is the kind that are needed to sustain life, like the ones you need for breathing, for your heart to beat, for blood pressure, for your reflexes, for digestion, for excretion, that means pooping. Okay, those are all going to be wired at birth. And the ones that you need to begin learning through sensory input are also going to be wired. All of the remaining wiring that you have is very tentative, which means it's not permanent, it may change. And it is due to experiences, which along with your genes, which will make each person unique and will make your wiring completely unique. So again, that's environment versus genetics, so nature versus nurture, determining the wiring of your brain. So they work together quite a bit. All right, so as soon as sections of the brain are wired, connections must be sorted in a step-by-step process. We call this process learning. Everything in the sorting process depends on the physical well-being and quality of age-appropriate experiences. With each experience, for example, from simply looking at an object to working an equation, signals are sent from one neuron to other neurons. One neuron can connect with as many as 250,000 other neurons at the same time. How is this possible? Neurons never touch each other. There is a tiny gap between neurons, which we call a synapse. A chemical and electrical signal that we call a neurotransmitter leaves the axon of one neuron and jumps the synapse to travel to the dendrite of another neuron. We call this process firing. Let's talk about the firing process. Having repeated and varied experiences will trigger repeated firings in different parts of your brain. Repeated firings along the connections will result in strengthening the connections and forming even more synapses in order to enable more learning. Babies begin with about 1,000 trillion connections. which allows for very rapid learning during their early years. Each sensory input that you have, which is what you see, you hear, you feel, you smell, or taste, goes to its own primary sensory cortex. Neurons in the primary sensory cortex receive only very basic information related to the five senses. For example, in the hearing area, the neurons receive pitch and volume. Unless sensory organs are damaged, everyone has these sensory inputs. From here, this information travels to neurons in the sensory association area, which is the largest part of the brain. Through many experiences, the brain makes sound associations, such as knowing the sound of an emergency vehicle siren, a bird call, or ice falling into a cup. Quality experiences determine the richness of associations and therefore learning. Another area of the brain, the multimodal area, is used for combining two or more sensory association areas. For example, the brain can process motor movement used in talking and emotional overtones in what is said at the very same time. The multimodal areas also process thinking that does not need sensory inputs, such as planning and decision making. The brain can use a stronger connection more easily than a weak one. Over time, the brain continues to strengthen used pathways. Because some connections are used so much, they become automatic or hardwired. What are some connections that are hardwired in your brain? Think about it. Okay, I'll give you an example. When you handwrite, you no longer think about forming the letters, you just do it. Okay? Another thing would be if you drive now, driving the same route to school every day, sometimes you might forget that you did it because driving is hardwired, and driving that particular route got hardwired into your brain because you do it so often. Connections that become hardwired are things that are not forgotten. Riding a bicycle, playing a musical instrument, or playing a sport are other skills that are automatic once you learn how to do them, and you don't forget them because they're hardwired. Lastly, the pruning process. In order to make your brain as efficient as possible, it can't keep connections that you never use. The brain weeds out these connections in a process we call pruning. Healthy pruning allows remaining connections to become strong, which will increase the speed and efficiency for the brain cells that you use most often. Too much pruning means the person will find it difficult to develop certain needed skills and abilities. Pruning begins in the very first years of a child's life and is almost completed by 10 years of age. For example, at birth, each neuron has 25,000 synapses. By 3 years of age, each neuron has pruned 10,000 of those tentative connections. For the brain to work well, signals have to fire quickly. Similar to electrical tape that's wrapped around wires, myelin is a fatty substance that is formed by those glial cells, and it wraps around the longer axons and cushions those cell bodies of the neurons. If we didn't have myelin on our cells, the signals would travel 30 times slower. Now let's talk about brain plasticity. Babies and children until 10 years of age create many new connections in their brains. After 10 years of age, pruning is pretty aggressive. Does this mean that a child who didn't have a quality experience cannot learn and catch up with their peers? Can a person who suffers a brain injury ever recover? Can adults who need to learn new skills for their careers do so? Can older adults who develop a new interest, like learning a new language, gain new abilities? The answers to all these questions is yes, because the human brain is adaptable. The brain has the ability to change or adapt to its environment. This ability to be shaped and later reshaped is what we call plasticity. For many years, scientists thought the brain was only plastic during the early years. Now they know the brain is plastic each time a person learns something new. So every time you learn a new skill, your brain is being plastic. Glial cells aid plasticity by dividing as a person needs more memory cells. Because the brain is plastic, a person can make up for lost function too. For example, although damaged neurons cannot be replaced, because remember we don't make more neurons, if they can't be replaced after an injury, nearby cells can change their functions to take on the functions of the damaged ones. This is another example of plasticity. Children's brains are more plastic than adults, though, for the following reasons. Children have more connections than they need to function. We have lost many of our connections. Rerouting communication among neurons is easier with more connections. Chemicals that aid making connections are far more active in earlier years. The brain of a 3-year-old is 2.5 times more active than an adult's brain. Lastly, connections are more flexible in the early years and they become stabilized as people age. Although your brain is plastic, timing is a very important concept when it comes to brain development. The entire brain is not wired at one time. Years ago, brain wiring was noted by observing the developmental skills in children. They called these periods the stages of development. Today, brain researchers use brain scans to note optimal times for making connections. They note 2 types of periods in wiring: critical periods and sensitive periods. Critical periods are times when some part of the brain is very vulnerable to lack of stimulation or to negative experiences. For example, if babies are born with cataracts and they don't have them removed in the first few months, they will be forever blind. Vision neurons will die without light stimulation. The brain is not plastic when it comes to most wiring completed during the first 6 months of pregnancy and for vision after birth. Sensitive periods are times when the brain is best able to wire specific skills for all children. Although the brain is plastic, matching the right skills to the sensitive times means easier learning, a better foundation for later skills, and performance at a higher level than if learned later. Hint, hint, this is a test question. Why is this information useful? Knowing when the brain timing for various skills occurs helps parents and teachers offer the right kinds of experiences for a child at the best possible times. They will know which skills they should encourage most and which will likely come at a later time. This can help children's brains reach their full potential. Offering the best experiences at the right times is called using the windows of opportunity. A window of opportunity is a prime period in a child's life for developing a particular skill. In this window, the child reaches a peak capacity to learn this skill if given the opportunity to do so. At this time, a certain type of stimulation is more critical than others. Given the right stimulation at the right time is very positive for development. On the other hand, if a child does not receive the right stimulation within given time frames, these times could be called windows of vulnerability. During windows of vulnerability, development is likely to be impaired. Each area has its own window of opportunity. Most windows are very large, which means the favorable time for learning this skill is many years. Motor development is a good example. Some windows are small, which means the most favorable time for learning is a few months, such as the window for vision. Often the windows of opportunity for various tasks will overlap. This means a child will likely be learning those skills at the same time if given the opportunity. Many of the overlapping skills are related, such as social attachments and emotional control. So think about your understanding of brain development in the early years. How important is good care for babies and young children? Well, we know that the earliest years are the most important for all areas of growth and development. All experiences will affect the brain's performance. The best experiences for young children include interaction with loving adults engaged in daily tasks and family-type activities. Even childcare programs for children under 3 should have a home-like atmosphere. Babies and very young children need not to be taught in a formal way. These children learn by playing, especially with caring adults. Children need choices in what and how to learn. Closely observing children and following their lead in play activities is usually best practice. Children usually choose age-appropriate experiences that parallel the windows of opportunity. Children need time to practice and master skills. Repetition of experiences develops the brain. Good books and a few quality toys that allow for different types of play, like blocks, balls, art material, sand, water, are better than toys with limited play possibilities. Why? There is a hierarchy of circuits in each area of the brain that mature at different times. Thus, the same environment will produce a different experience for a child at each stage of development. For example, in the vision area of the brain, seeing color, shape, and motion occurs before interpreting facial expression. Over a period of time, a child will learn something new from the very same book that they read all the time. Okay, I'm going to sum things up by talking about protecting the brain. The brain is part of your human body. Nutrition, sleep, physical activity, and general health are all going to affect a person's brain. For example, 60% of the daily nutrients are used by the brain during the first year. Okay, so 60% of the nutrients babies get from milk is used by the brain only. The fat content in breast milk or formula for infants and the whole milk for weaned toddlers is essential to develop that myelin that they need for their neurons. Do you know why tired people become fretful and say that their thinking is not clear? Without rest, your neurotransmitters become depleted. Rest restores the working of the brain. So if you wonder why you're not able to think in school all the time, it's because you don't sleep enough. Get more sleep. Your neurotransmitters are depleted. Rest is going to restore them. Without quality early experiences, brain connections are going to get pruned too much and the windows of opportunity are going to be missed. Although it doesn't happen often, overstimulation is also harmful. It can make children tired, frustrated, and unable to focus. Overstimulation, like loud music, can even cause hearing neurons to die. The worst offenders of normal brain development are factors that can cause harm to the unborn child. After birth, the worst offenders are lack of positive give and take with parents or toxic stress due to neglect or abuse. When too much harm occurs, children often have less capacity to learn. Toxic and long-term stress leads to emotional and behavior problems too. So, stress equals bad, which we already knew. All right, that's the end of section 1.